right, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon workshop where we'll be talking about some CBT fundamentals and the treatment of anxiety disorders. I am Dr. B. Logic Green. I'm a licensed clinical and community psychologist here in Atlanta, Georgia. I have an office space in Roswell where I practice integrated mental health treatment. I also work with the MHTTC from Emory University, and I am so pleased to be here with you all. I hope that today you'll be able to gain some things if you are not familiar with CBT at all. If you are familiar with CBT, hopefully this will be a great refresher or supplement. Is anyone else having audio? I see that someone had some audio difficulties. Is anyone else? Can folks just kind of give me a thumbs up if they hear me okay? Even if you just like put it on your screen. Okay. Okay, so it seems like mostly people can hear. Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. So for the person who is having audio concerns, maybe you and Simone can kind of troubleshoot a little bit to see if there's any help that we can offer. Otherwise, we will kind of keep moving. Hopefully, there'll be some time for some questions at the end of our session. But if not, you can always send follow-up emails to myself or to Stephanie Tapscott, and we'll get those questions answered. There's also a resource page that will have the handouts from today as well as handouts from previous workshops. Okay, so we can go ahead and get started. I'm just going to kind of share my screen and we'll go from there. All right. All right, so this is our agenda. We're going to talk about anxiety through a CBT lens, review some measures of anxiety. CBT is big on objective measures, and so I like to include at least 2 examples per session. I'm going to introduce the common tools that are used when treating anxiety disorders from CBT framework, talk about exposure. I'm also going to give a note on mindfulness and CBT. I think that sometimes there is a misunderstanding about what mindfulness is really used for. And so I like to really speak to mindfulness as a way of being, mindfulness as a way of seeing the world, even as kind of a cognitive technique, as opposed to mindfulness being exclusively a relaxation technique or primarily a relaxation technique. We will get to some challenges with implementing CBT and also just kind of see if we can draw some conclusions. So I'd like to get a sense of where people are in the room whenever we are embarking on this lunch conversation together. And so if Simone can just kind of put up the poll, 3 short questions. Just really finding out how you think about worry, how you think about anxiety. So if we ignore our worries, we will not be prepared when unwanted things happen. Is that true or false? 80% of what people worry about actually happens, so worry is generally helpful. Is that true or false? Okay. And then the last piece is clients who worry all the time should always delve into their worries because they're probably legitimate. They should always challenge their worries because challenging worry stops it. Or they should take a mindful approach to worries, recognizing that worries are thoughts and we can choose which thoughts to attach to. Okay. So far, most folks believe that if we ignore our worries, we won't be prepared when unwanted things happen. Okay. Most people do not believe that 80% of what we worry about actually happens, so worry is generally helpful. Okay. So that's an interesting contrast, right? Because if we believe that if we ignore our worries, we won't be prepared when unwanted things happen, but then we also recognize that generally worry is not helpful, then we can already see that even as practitioners, we might be of 2 minds when it comes to thinking about worry. And most of us believe that clients should take a mindful approach. Thank you, Simone. when looking at worries, recognizing that worries are thoughts. And so I think it's important for us to know where we stand as clinicians, because that can also help us identify how we connect with clients who have anxiety, whether or not we're able to recognize if the person in front of us is actually reacting to a situation of legitimate threat, or if a person might be catastrophizing or over responding to a anxiety-provoking situation, but not necessarily a fearful situation. So knowing where we are can really help us understand how we are also kind of influenced by anxiety and how that might show up in the work that we do with clients. So one of the things that is really important with recognizing anxiety as an emotion and anxiety as a disorder is that anxiety is a very somatic experience. That when experiencing anxiety, clients often can tell you what their body is doing. They have nausea, a queasy feeling in their stomach, heart palpitations, sweaty palms, maybe they're feeling lightheaded. It's a very somatic experience. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to practice managing our own bodies for just a moment. One of the breathing techniques that I like to teach to my clients, especially those who have panic disorder, is a breathing technique where the exhale is longer than the inhale. And the idea of that is when you teach clients to exhale for more counts than they inhale, you are slowing down the heart rate. You are slowing down the rate of breathing. And that can make it less likely that they will hyperventilate during a panic attack, for example. So if we could just take a few moments, if you will oblige me, to just put your feet flat on the floor. If you can just kind of roll your shoulders down and back, maybe shake out your upper body just a little, move your head from side to side, just to kind of get ready to breathe. You can keep your eyes open, that's fine, or closed if you like. And just uncross all of your limbs. And I'm going to invite you to breathe in for 4 counts and to breathe out for 6. So we're just going to inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now exhale, empty the lungs all the way out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, inhale, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, one more time. Inhale, 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That straightforward breathing technique can really help clients modulate their own bodily sensations, and that can make it less likely that their anxiety will continue to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up, as it does with experiences like a panic attack or having kind of panic disorder. So that's a tool, right? All right. So anxiety is pretty common. According to the World Health Organization, as of 2023, anxiety disorders are actually the world's most common disorder, affecting 301 million people in 2019 alone. And the prevalence of anxiety disorders is higher among females than males, and symptoms often show up in early childhood and adolescence. And many of us, I think, are seeing this with many of our kids who are expressing a lot of anxiety. I think especially since COVID, anxiety has really come to the forefront as a challenge that many young people are facing. And to go through something like COVID in a state of isolation, so many people have, and so many young people have, can really make it harder to combat anxiety. Because anxiety is one of those disorders that, left to its own devices, it can just kind of spiral and spiral and spiral. And often having contact with other people can help you investigate and assess whether or not your anxious thoughts are really that realistic, can also help you determine and recognize the amount of resources that you have to kind of meet distressing situations. And so isolation really doesn't help with anxiety. And we know that there are highly effective treatments for anxiety disorders. And so I think that's a place of light and a place to kind of really have some optimism that although anxiety can go from being uncomfortable to debilitating, there are ways that we can treat anxiety that can really help to shift a person's experience and in some ways really change their lives. So what would anxiety look like? And I want to distinguish here between anxiety as an emotion and anxiety as a disorder. So many clients call me and say, I have anxiety. And I think in the popular culture, there's been a conflation of the experience of anxiety with the sense that when we experience anxiety, we're experiencing something wrong. Anxiety is an emotion, like any other emotion. If anyone has seen Inside Out 2, they introduced, right, the emotion of anxiety, not the disorder of anxiety. So given that anxiety is an emotion, it's important to recognize that our emotions have functions and our emotions are quite normative. If a person is feeling anxiety going into a new social situation, that's normative. If a person is experiencing anxiety after a job interview and they're waiting to hear back about whether or not they received a job, that's normative. These are situations where there's a certain amount of social risk. There is a certain amount of caring about the result, right? These are important and significant situations. And so it makes sense that there would be some anxiety. Anxiety can actually let us know that we care about the thing that we are engaged in. So in and of itself, anxiety is not problematic. When anxiety becomes problematic, that's when we start to look at disorder. When anxiety is outlasting the stimulus or the experience, when anxiety is showing up in the face of situations that are not necessarily dangerous or significant, when anxiety becomes paralyzing and out of control, now we have moved from anxiety being an emotion to the realm of anxiety being challenging or maybe even clinically significant. And so when we're talking about clinically significant anxiety, that's where you get the excessive fear, worry, and the worry could be about particular kinds of things like phobias, right? I have a client who's afraid of spiders, and so we talk about that phobia. Or the worry might be more generalized. I'm worried about the election, and I'm worried about having a disease, and I'm worried about what's going to happen in retirement, and I'm worried about the weather, and I'm worried that my car is going to break down, and I'm worried that this pimple on my neck is skin cancer, right? The worries really balloon and they kind of jump from one thing to another. And often those worries are not decreased or diminished by someone saying, hey, like I had that same bump on my neck and it actually wasn't cancer for me. It was just a mole, for example, right? Like a person who is really suffering with generalized anxiety disorder, for example, might not be able to hear that and to receive that. Often we're talking about clinically significant anxiety when we have these kind of physical correlates that stay around. So you have the excessive worry with bodily tension, right? You have this nausea, this lightheadedness. In the case of panic disorder, you have repeated experiences of panic attacks. In the case of PTSD, for example, which used to be categorized under anxiety disorders, but now is categorized separately in the DSM. But it used to be that when we talked about PTSD, we talked about it in the realm of the ways in which clients react to triggers. And one of the ways that clients often react to triggers is a typical anxiety response, which is avoidance, right? I don't go to places like that. I don't talk to people who remind me of, I don't engage with movies or other material that might take me back to that particular moment. So clinically significant anxiety is often disruptive to a person's functioning. It doesn't mean that they're completely paralyzed by life, but it often means that there are certain things that they cannot do or will not do because of their fear of anxiety. So we want to really distinguish. So that's what anxiety can look like. I wanted to give you all a sense of what anxiety can feel like. So hopefully everyone can hear.
Instructions on having the perfect panic attack. Find a trigger, a job interview, the claustrophobia of mass transit, deciding what to have for dinner. It will help if you have a chronic condition, severe depression, an anxiety disorder, asthma. This is ideal, but may not be possible for everyone. your body will instinctively revert to its most primal state, fearing for your life. Your sympathetic nervous system will activate its fight or flight response in the face of this perceived danger, this decision between Chipotle and Chinese food. The body can only panic for a maximum of about 20 minutes. Follow these instructions closely to make the most of this time. Your breathing is the only part of this process you can control. Do not. This would drastically shorten the attack. Focus on the constricting of your rib cage, on your drum major heart conducting this frantic march. Mistake this for a heart attack or a stroke. If successful, you may lose control of your extremities. The caveman in your limbs will tense every muscle to flee his predator. Your arms and legs will go numb. Starting at your hands and feet, every twitch and tingle, an attempt to run for your life. Stay in place. Do not go for a walk. Do not call your friends, your mother, your psychiatrist, an ambulance. By now, you should be in a full panic. Hyperventilation cutting off oxygen to your brain. You will feel faint, become certain of your own death. Do not call your friends. Do not call your mother. Do not call your psychiatrist. A panic attack is a remarkably solitary experience. The presence of another person could have a calming effect and cut the attack short. Resist the temptation to fumble a hand through the desk drawer for the medication you've been prescribed for this. Instead, locate the toolkit your grandfather gave you 3 years ago, and he told you, I'm giving you this so you can fix anything. Place it on the desk. Open it. Steady your right hand long enough to grasp the box cutter. Note how close the blood vessels lie beneath the sheets of your skin. Place the blade of the box cutter to the snare drum in your wrist. At this point, your panic attack may begin to ebb. The body can only panic for a maximum of about 20 minutes. As your breathing and heart rate steady, find a bottle of water to hydrate yourself. Drop the box cutter into the garbage can. Return the toolkit to the desk drawer. Distract yourself with a walk or a TV show. Your body will assume it has survived for another day. Until the next trigger, at which point you will repeat the process. But do remember, you are not having a heart attack. You are not dying. The body can only panic for a maximum of about 20 minutes. And in that time, every piece of you, every basic, primal piece of you is screaming for you to survive.
Any reactions? I'll just stop sharing for a moment. You can drop in the chat. Any reactions? Not that we're encouraging people to practice having panic attacks, but I thought he did such an important job of explaining and illustrating how powerful the physical experience of a panic attack can be. Someone want to say something? Any responses? He also mentioned a couple of important things not to do. And the things that he mentioned, that was intense, yeah. Which a panic attack often feels quite intense. People who experience panic attacks often say things like, I thought I was going to die. I thought I was having a heart attack. I thought I was going crazy. I thought I was losing my mind. And one of the most important pieces when working with people who have panic attacks and panic disorder is to help them recognize something that this poet said over and over again, that the body is trying to survive, right? The body is not interested in killing itself. So having a panic attack, while it does feel very overwhelming and it feels very intense, the body is not actually trying to harm itself. And unless your client does have a heart condition or does have asthma or some underlying kind of medical concern, a panic attack is a really intense bodily experience that is made worse by our cognitions about the attack. And so really keeping that in mind, I think, can be helpful. And so I thought he did a really good job of kind of just marrying those things together. So if you have any other responses, you can kind of drop them in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and share the next set of slides. All right. All right. So anxiety is connected to fear. It is not Fear, exactly. But it is connected to the experience and to the feeling of fear. And fear is an evolutionary response. It's an emotion that evolved as a way to keep us safe, as a way to make sure that we survive actual threats out in at the time of like our ancestors, right? Out in the bush, out in the forest, out in these places where we were encountering real dangers and real kind of threats to our lives. And so because fear is a natural response for our survival, it's not only emotional and psychological, it is also very physical. The thing about fear is usually directed towards a particular stimulus. So we feel fearful because the tiger is in the bushes. We've identified that the tiger is in the bushes. Our body mobilizes to survive the tiger being in the bushes. And then once the tiger goes away or we have gone away, all of our physical responses come down. That is how fear is designed. The stimulus, we experience fear, we survive the threat, hopefully, and then we return to a state of homeostasis. In anxiety, that doesn't always happen. The physical correlates of anxiety sometimes kind of stay elevated. And so a person is consistently in a state of hypervigilance, where they're kind of on edge, where they're not quite ready to relax, where their muscles are always tense. This is not a state that the body is meant to be in. And so there are long-term health effects of extended periods of anxiety because the body does fatigue from constant tension and constant stress. So it's really important to help clients manage their bodily experiences so that they can have a better chance of being healthy kind of overall. Anxiety becomes problematic when we perceive danger when there is not actually a threat. That's also a difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is designed to help us survive a danger. Anxiety might identify danger when there actually is no threat. And so CBT says that clients who experience anxiety often overestimate threat and underestimate their resources. So I think that going into a new situation, let's say I have to do some professional networking, I think that's the scariest thing. I would do everything in my power to avoid doing that. I would rather have a root canal than go to a networking event with people I don't know. I have likely overestimated that danger. And I have also underestimated my ability to manage my discomfort. I've underestimated my ability because I'm doing everything I can to avoid it. I'm not considering that maybe going to the event, I might actually have an experience in addition to my anxiety. Maybe I might meet someone and have an interesting conversation. Maybe I might learn something new. Maybe I might just have the experience of being in a room with people I don't know and no one is laughing at me or judging me or rejecting me. It might be a completely neutral experience. But if I think and my only option for managing my anxiety is avoidance, I will do that over and over and over again. And the problem with avoidance when it comes to anxiety is that avoidance often maintains anxiety. So to help the anxious client, we have to understand the content of their fears and the ways in which they might be coping ineffectively. A note on fear. We have four options when it comes to surviving a dangerous scenario. We run, we fight, we freeze, or we fawn. Run, that's pretty self-explanatory. The fighting, self-explanatory. Freezing, we go into a state of paralysis. None of these options, by the way, are ones that we are consciously choosing. And often when folks might experience the freeze response, they might also experience dissociation where they're kind of disconnected from themselves. The fawn response, we are appeasing the perpetrator or the dangerous scenario as a way to decrease our levels of threat. So it's really important to help clients distinguish between whether or not they're in an actually threatening situation, and these responses are all appropriate because they're helping us survive, or they're just in a situation of distress where these responses actually might be inappropriate. So, for example, if we're talking about an anxiety-provoking situation that might be uncomfortable but isn't actually dangerous, instead of fighting, a client might actually need to address the situation assertively. They might need to listen more or take accountability. instead of fleeing, they might actually need to hang around. They might need to confront. They might need to have a conversation. Rather than freezing, they might need to do the exact opposite. Do anything, do something. Rather than fawning and trying everything they can to appease the person, they might actually need to set boundaries. They might actually need to state a desire or a need. You really want to distinguish, are we talking about threat or are we talking about distress? So, as I said before, CBT really likes objective measures. So, it really believes that we need measures in order to determine the effectiveness of our work. And so, this is a popular brief screen or anxiety measure that is used for generalized anxiety disorder. So, as you can see, this measure is looking at the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder over the last 2 weeks and really asking the client to rate how often they experience those symptoms and then how challenging those symptoms were for them. It's really important that we kind of consider using measures like this when we're bringing clients in so that rather than clients having to remember just kind of on the spot, they can know and expect that we will be kind of tracking their anxiety in this way. So the GAD-7, it's a brief screener. It's something that is evidence-based and it's popular in the field, easy to use, easy to score. Of course, subjective units of distress. I always think that these are really helpful for just helping clients to get a sense of the intensity of their anxiety. The subjective units of distress scale is actually really important when it comes to the exposure piece of anxiety treatment. There's the cognitive piece, but there's also the exposure piece. And we use the subscale a lot because we want clients to be able to differentiate between really high levels of anxiety, medium levels of anxiety, and low levels of anxiety, because that can help them see how they are progressing and moving when it comes to exposure. The Beck Anxiety Inventory, this is another really popular anxiety measure. And this is really bodily based symptoms, right? It's very kind of physical. So it's really kind of looking at the extent to which a client experienced and was bothered by these symptoms. And it's also looking at kind of the variety of physical symptoms that a person can experience regardless of the kind of anxiety disorder that they have. So a generalized anxiety disorder, I might not experience numbness or tingling, but I might have the difficulty relaxing, right? I might also have the pounding heart. With PTSD, I might experience terror, fear, and I might also have the fear of dying, but I might not experience that in phobias. So the Beck Anxiety Inventory is really looking at a variety of physical symptoms that show up across anxiety disorders. So it's also pretty straightforward, pretty easy to score. So I want to talk a little bit about some specific anxiety disorders. Although the underlying components of anxiety disorders are the same, specific disorders often speak to specific fears. And that's why it's important for us to really be able to help clients distinguish what they are really fearing, what they're afraid of. Anxiety can also be maintained by ambiguity. So with a specific phobia, a person might say, I'm afraid of spiders. Okay, well, what scares you about spiders? Well, I don't know. They have all those legs and they just kind of go everywhere. Okay, well, what's scary about that? Well, I might find a spider in my bag. Okay, well, what do you imagine would happen if you found a spider in your bag? Well, it might bite me. Okay, well, have you ever been bitten by a spider? Well, no, but I know that happens. Okay, well, it's never happened to you. And how often have you experienced spiders? Well, I don't know. I mean, I see a spider about once a month. Okay, and you've never been bitten by a spider. No. Well, what's your fear about what would happen if they bit you? Right? Like we're continuing to go down the road of really trying to nail down what is it about the spider that is scary for them. And often what you find is that it's not exactly about the spider. It's kind of about the spider, but not really about the spider. It might be about, well, having spiders might show that I am vulnerable to danger or disease, or if I'm afraid of roaches and I have roaches in my house, maybe I'm not really afraid of roaches, but roaches have been associated with dirtiness in my life. And so really I'm afraid of judgment. So we want to know specifically what are clients afraid of, right? So With social anxiety, I am afraid that people will laugh at me. Okay. Well, what's scary about that? Well, if people laugh at me, they'll think I'm weird. Well, what's scary about that? Right? We're really trying to figure out what's scary, what's scary, what's scary, what's scary to really help clients nail down what the fear is, and then to help clients imagine what's the worst case scenario. And 9 times out of 10, when clients are able to imagine the worst case scenario and imagine themselves surviving the worst case scenario, that in and of itself can help lay the groundwork to reduce anxiety, right? Remember, this is kind of the working model that kind of we have been looking at, where we have a situation, thoughts and cognitions that impact physical symptoms, but the thoughts and cognitions also impact emotions. The emotions impact the thoughts and cognitions, and all of that impact behavior. Cognitive restructuring, when we are talking about anxiety, is really looking at 5 main areas: the probability error, the catastrophic error, the resource error, managing worry, and mindfulness. This is really where we're spending our time and helping clients shift how they might be thinking about their experiences, because how they're thinking about their experiences increases or decreases their experience of anxiety. The probability error. So the probability error is kind of what it sounds like. Anxious individuals can have a hard time identifying how likely an outcome is versus not. So I often use cognitive processing therapy in working with my clients who have PTSD or trauma stressor related disorders. And often we come to a particular scenario that they've created in their minds about what could happen, what's likely to happen. And so one of the questions that I often ask them is, okay, the thing that you're worried about happening, how probable is it that this thing is going to happen? Are we talking about something that's likely or something that's possible? And an example that I often use is I'll use the weather and say, okay, so today here, I think it's like 85 degrees or something. How likely is it to snow? My client will look at me and say, well, to snow, I mean, it's not likely to snow. And I say, well, how do you know that? Well, I don't know, because it's a sunny day, it's 85 degrees, it doesn't usually snow 85 degrees. I looked at the weather report, it doesn't look like there's any snow, it doesn't really snow much in the south, right? And so I point them towards, when we are estimating probability and likelihood, we look at evidence. We're not just talking about possibility. Is it possible that it could snow today? Sure. So many things are possible. But what we really want to know beyond possibility is probability. How likely is it? And when we look at the likelihood of something, that's where we start to look at evidence. We look at weather reports. We look at history of something. We look at our own experience. And we use that as a way to challenge cognitive beliefs that might actually not be that helpful. And so the probability error is really about noticing the ways in which clients are overestimating the likelihood of something and helping them to use evidence to scale back into what is probable and what is likely. When I talk to clients about evidence, I always say evidence is something you would submit in a court of law. Evidence is not other thoughts. So having a thought that, well, because I think this, that's not the same as evidence. That is just another thought. So really helping clients distinguish between the thing that I'm saying, is it evidence or is it just me finding other thoughts that resonate with the original anxious thought that I had? So crowded questioning, that's of course how we get to breaking apart the probability error. And you can also use exposures here to combat the probability error. It's important to start with a cognitive place before you move to exposures, because you're also preparing clients to develop their own resources before moving into anxiety-provoking situations, which exposures are. But one of the functions that exposures serve is to counteract the probability error. The catastrophic error. So not only do clients with anxiety overestimate the likelihood that something will happen, but they also maximize or amplify the potential impact of a search situation. They often move towards worst case scenario. And so the catastrophic era is often an ineffective use of imagination. It's thinking about all of the what ifs. And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And often the catastrophe that a client is worried about is not in the present. They're somewhere in the past or in the future. So a client is driving along the highway and they just missed an accident. Right, they recognize that an accident happened maybe 30 seconds before they got there. And so they drive and they get home and they are nervous. Their palms are sweaty, they're shaking, they're having trouble breathing. And maybe their partner comes to them and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And the person says, "Oh my gosh, I just missed an accident. There was an accident that happened 30 seconds before me. I could have been in that accident." And can you imagine what would have happened if I was in that accident? Like, I just get so worried about being in car accidents. Like, I could have been killed, or maybe I could have been paralyzed. Right? And now we're using imagination to think about what could have happened sometime in the past. We're taking the catastrophe and we're putting it back there, not at all paying attention to the fact that this person is completely intact and healthy, having a conversation in the present about what could have happened. The same thing is true with projecting the catastrophe into the future. We're thinking about, well, maybe tomorrow, I know it's going to rain and I could get an accident in the rain because it's higher likelihood that I'll be in an accident in the rain because people generally experience auto accidents in the rain more than when it's not raining. And it's also going to be a busy day. And now I'm catastrophizing in the future. And so it's really helpful to let clients recognize what they're doing. And I often call this time traveling. Right? I said, "Oh, we're time traveling again. We're somewhere in the future. We're somewhere in the past, and we're not paying attention to the present." Because more often than not, the catastrophe is not happening in the present. So the client is actually manufacturing anxiety when in fact they are not in a dangerous or distressing situation. So it's important, right, to help clients recognize that. Sometimes it's also helpful to help a client walk through the worst case scenario. And often the worst case scenario isn't actually death. Sometimes it is, but often it is not. And so when you allow a client to walk through the worst case scenario, first, it makes them identify and really hone in on what their fear is rather than leaving it in this ambiguous space. But then it also gives the client the opportunity to imagine surviving or even coping well with the worst case scenario. This helps clients recognize that they might actually have more resources than they thought. Because remember, anxious clients overestimate threat and underestimate their resources. So this is a way of helping clients to recognize, oh, wait a minute, even if the worst happens, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Maybe it isn't so scary. Mindfulness can also help with catastrophe. And not so much because mindfulness can be relaxing, it can be. But mindfulness is more about being able to accepting that there are some things that we have control over in our lives, and there are some things that we don't. And we often have to practice acceptance. Acceptance often does not come easy to human beings. We like to feel like we are in control, especially of the things that we care about. And so the practice of mindfulness can really create a willingness and acceptance to meet life as it is. And part of meeting life as it is means understanding and knowing that catastrophes happen, and no amount of worrying about the catastrophe will prevent the catastrophe in most cases. The resource error. We've already alluded to the fact that often anxious clients underestimate their own resources. And so often clients become anxious about being anxious because they already think they don't have what they need to manage the anxiety. And so even if they're not anxious about the situation itself, they're anxious that they might become anxious because they don't believe that they can manage the anxiety. So we also want to pay attention to that. The anxiety is sometimes just about, oh my gosh, what if I get there and I'm anxious and I don't know how to manage my anxiety? So we can walk through that. We can help a client imagine successfully coping with a situation where they might feel anxious. It's also important to recognize that worry in and of itself is often a type of avoidance. Sometimes worry can be helpful, and we'll talk about when worry is helpful or productive, but oftentimes worry is not. And worry is a way of avoiding action. Worry is a way of avoiding change or avoiding even emotion. If I worry about whether or not I'm going to lose weight this week and I'm not changing my diet or I'm not cutting back on sugar and I'm not walking the way I said I would, but I'm worrying a lot about it, that might give me the impression that I'm doing something to move towards my goal. But if I'm acting, I don't have to worry because I'm actually doing the thing. So we can recognize that worry can be avoidance, and it can be helpful to help clients recognize when worry is avoidance, because then it's not really the worry that we need to worry so much about. It's actually really discovering with the client, if it's not about the worry, what are you avoiding? What are you thinking about if you weren't worried about this? What would you be doing if you weren't worried about this? Might there be some feeling that you need to feel, some question that you need to answer, some action that you need to take? Behavioral techniques are often really helpful, or also really helpful in helping to undergird a client's understanding that they, in many cases, have the resources that they need to manage their anxiety. And if they don't, those resources can be obtained. I want to introduce The Worry Cure. The Worry Cure is a book that was written by Robert Leahy and published in 2005. And Leahy does a really, I think, clear and straightforward job of helping us to unpack worry in a way that I think is quite accessible and relevant. He talks about worry as a cognitive avoidance strategy, right? We're often worried about the things that we're not doing, and we're usually, when we're doing things, we're just not worrying about them. Worry evolved as a survival mechanism. It can be used to solve problems. And this is where we get into productive worry. Productive worry is the kind of worry that leads us to solutions, that leads us to action plans. Sometimes that leads us to the conclusion that maybe there isn't any action to take. Our only thing to really do is to turn towards acceptance. But worry can also be unproductive. And that's the worry that breeds other worries, the what ifs that breed other what ifs. The catastrophizing, the thinking about what could have happened in the past or what could have happened or what could happen in the future. That's often unproductive worry. That's the hamster wheel. Worry can make us believe that we are controlling uncertainty, and sometimes we can come and find that in phobias, actually, or even in OCD, because sometimes in obsessions, a client may have the belief that if they walk a certain way, then that means their sister won't become ill, right? They make associations between things that are not related as a way of trying to control the thing that can't be controlled. Or they might think, well, if I don't wear red, then I won't give in to these thoughts that are unacceptable to me, right? They conflate and associate things that are not associated as a way of trying to prevent themselves from giving into impulses because they don't believe that they can't, but they can prevent themselves from giving into impulses. So worry is a way, or can be a way, of trying to control something that isn't really controlling the thing, right? We're not able to control uncertainty in that way. Worry can also be a way of seeking reassurance, especially when it comes to being with another person. And it also can be seen as a prevention strategy. Now, I asked a question earlier in the poll, worrying about something, right, true or false, worrying about something allows me to be prepared if something happens in the future. Worrying about something is not the same as planning. If I worry about it raining tomorrow, and I worry about it raining tomorrow, and I worry about it raining tomorrow, but I don't put an umbrella in my car, and I don't get my raincoat, and I don't wear the boots I need to wear, and I don't dress appropriately, then my worry hasn't actually led me to a plan. And if I'm engaged in the plan, then I don't need to worry. So this idea that worry can help us prevent danger is a really popular idea, but it often is one that is missing something, because worry without a plan is actually not preventing anything. So there are a couple of tips to help clients manage worry. Mindfulness and acceptance, we've talked about that. Mindfulness says we can meet the present moment as it is, with awareness, with compassion, and with a willingness to accept. Deciding if worries are productive or unproductive. We want to problem solve if you do find that worries are productive, right? Let's create an action plan. Designate worry time. I find this to be a funny intervention because my clients often look at me like, really, Dr. Green, that's what you want me to do? So worry time is really a way of helping clients contain their worry. And what it is you will say, okay, you come to me and you say that you worry all day long, you worry about all kinds of things. What I'd like you to do for the next week is to set aside 20 to 30 minutes a day. And I want you to really think about what time of day you're going to do it and see if you can do it the same time of day every day. And in those 20 to 30 minutes, I want you to worry. I want you to write down all of the things that you're worried about and really try to worry for the entire time. If you find yourself that you stopped worrying, just figure out if there's something else you can worry about. Now, the rule is that you can't worry outside of that time. So if your time is from 8:30 to 9 and you find that a worry pops up at 10, you have to say to the worry, all right, I'll worry about you next time in worry time. And often what happens when clients come in, they say things like, hey, I didn't use the whole time to worry. I found that I was worrying about the same things over and over again. I found that as I was doing this worry, and then I came out of it, if a worry came up, I really could tell myself, okay, well, I'll worry about it next time. So what you have done is you have given clients an opportunity to recognize that they have more control over their worry than they think. You've also given them the opportunity to identify the fact that even though they might feel like they're worrying all day long about a lot of different things, they're probably only worrying about a certain proportion of things, maybe 5 things that are showing up in different ways, and that they have the resources to control when they worry and how attached they become to their worrying thoughts. Cognitive restructuring, we already talked about that. And one of the things that also can really help worry is helping clients to engage in lives that are compelling to them, where they don't actually have a lot of time to worry because they're engaged in their lives and they're engaged in their lives in ways that are fulfilling and meaningful for them. Mindfulness, again, not a relaxation technique. It helps clients to release attachment to their own stories and to their narratives. And it also releases the tendency to challenge thoughts. Although cognitive behavioral therapy really looks at and utilizes thought challenging as a technique, sometimes that's actually not very helpful. And so mindfulness says, well, instead of fighting against my thoughts, like I'm kind of going to drop the rope and I'm going to recognize that these worry thoughts are there, but I do have control over how attached I become to the thoughts. I do have control over whether or not these thoughts get to control me. Mindfulness can increase client capacity to manage distress and also increase their resources to manage the present moment. So let's talk about exposure. Remember, when we're talking about anxiety, we have to deal with the cognitions, but we also have to deal with the somatics and the behavioral pieces. There are different kinds of exposure types. Well, why exposure in the first place? Exposure is a really good way of helping clients have the experience of resourcing. I can tell a client who is triggered by the grocery store, if you go into a grocery store and you get your groceries, you are likely to survive the grocery store. I know that there is unpredictable violence that is happening in our communities and our society, and I don't want to downplay that. And more often than not, most of us, fortunately, when we go to the grocery store, we're able to survive the grocery store. You're also not likely to get into a random fight in the grocery store. Somebody is not likely to kind of follow you and harass you. Does it happen? Absolutely. Does it happen every time you go to the grocery store or most of the time you go to the grocery store? For most people, no. That I can tell a client that all day, but that does not compare at all to the client having the experience of going to the grocery store over and over again and finding that they survive the grocery store, going to the grocery store and encountering strangers that they don't know and surviving those encounters, going to the grocery store and maybe feeling annoyed or irritated and finding that they can feel annoyed or irritated and there's no catastrophe. Exposure really serves to help clients learn through experience about their own resources. It also gives clients the opportunity to test out their own fear hypotheses, right? If I talk to the stranger, are they going to judge me? Are they going to reject me? Are they going to yell at me? And when a client finds that that doesn't happen, that pushes back against this hypothesis they have about worst case scenario or the fear. or catastrophizing. Now, a client may very well have a social interaction that they don't like or that's uncomfortable for them, but that's also a part of the exposure, right? To manage the distress that comes up without making things worse. Exposure also provides clients the opportunity to be in anxiety-provoking situations without relying on their safety behaviors. So in the case of OCD, for example, maybe you want a client to think about these thoughts that they're afraid of, or you want a client to encounter these circumstances that they're afraid of without relying on the ways that they would normally avoid that, without relying on the thought techniques, right, that they would use to try to avoid that, or the compulsions that they would use to avoid the discomfort of those situations. So we have four main types of exposure that we talk about: imagining, in vivo, virtual, and interoceptive. Imagining exposure, in vivo exposures, these are useful across anxiety disorders. I use them a lot when I do prolonged exposure therapy with my folks with PTSD. Imaginal exposure is what it sounds like. It really is using the imagination to bring up a past experience that a person has had and expose that person to the memory of the event repeatedly. And you're doing this because through repeated exposure from the imagination, the reactivity to whatever the event is actually decreases. Now, again, you're not doing exposure without kind of the cognitive piece built up. We've built up some cognitive pieces, and we've also built up some resources before we head into exposure. When a person comes into my office, we don't immediately say, okay, we're going to do some imaginal exposure because you said that the grocery store is triggering for you. There's some work to do before that. But I do want to just kind of introduce the kinds of exposures that people and clients experience. So imagining exposure, we're bringing up a past event and we exposing the client to the past event. Or you can use imagining exposure to rehearse something that might happen in the future. So if you take somebody who's afraid of public speaking, you can really have them imagine, okay, you're standing on the stage, you're in front of the podium, you have the microphone, what are you wearing? How do you feel? How big is the crowd? Can you see the lights? Can you feel nervousness? Okay, let's imagine that you're giving a speech. Let's imagine that you're feeling anxious. What are the things that you can do while you're giving the speech to help alleviate your anxiety, or right before, right after? Okay, let's see yourself moving all the way through the speech. Okay, what is the audience doing at the end? Oh, they're smiling, they're clapping, right? They're giving you positive feedback. You're really helping the client use their imagination to rehearse something that is actually a positive outcome. In vivo is real life exposure. Now, there are some circumstances we cannot actually expose a client to because it's unethical or because it might be impossible. And so in vivo exposures are really relegated to the kinds of things that clients can do. So I have a client who is afraid of heights. And one of the things that we do, or we have done, is we think about gradual ways that this person can go to the highest height that they can think of that they actually have access to. Now, right, they can't go to the top of the Eiffel Tower. We don't live in France. But there are places where they can go to still bring up that level of anxiety, where they can expose themselves to this distressing stimulus, and they can use their resources to survive it. Virtual exposure, it's a similar kind of thing in that you are exposing clients to scenarios and situations that you would not be able to do in real life, either because of access or it's just impossible to. And you use kind of virtual reality, use technology to help clients have the experience of being exposed to potentially anxiety-provoking or actually anxiety-provoking situations. And some of those situations might actually be dangerous, right? So sometimes virtual technology is used to expose combat veterans to combat situations. Now, you can't do that ethically, put someone in combat theater, right, who was not enlisted and they're not kind of in war, but you can do that as a way of treatment through virtual technology. And interoceptive. Interoceptive exposure is really about exposing a client to their own bodily sensation that might be uncomfortable. So when I was in graduate school, when we were learning about panic disorder, one of the exercises that we did was an interoceptive exposure exercise. And our professor gave us a small coffee stirrer straw, a little plastic straw, and had us close our nose and breathe through the straw. And the idea is that this will give us the sense of having a bit of shortness of breath. And so how do we respond to that bit of shortness of breath? I will say I did not really feel that strong for as long as I was supposed to. Because for me, it was very, very anxiety provoking. But that is an example of interoceptive exposure. It can be really, 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 really helpful, especially in working with people who have panic attacks. I know I've mentioned that many times, but really part of the essence of a panic attack is that a person is having bodily experiences. And because of how they're interpreting those experiences become amplified. And then a panic attack ensues. If you can teach a person to manage their own body and their body discomforts without amplifying those sensations, you are really likely to help cure a person's experiences of panic disorder. It doesn't mean they'll never have a panic attack again, but they are far less likely to have a panic attack. And when they start to have those bodily sensations, they are far more likely to be in control of them. There are steps to exposure. Again, you don't just throw somebody into any of those exposure situations. You want to kind of do the resourcing first, but you also want to identify specific situations that trigger clients, discuss why you're talking about exposure and how avoidance maintains anxiety and maintains symptoms, remind clients that exposure is successful because they face their fears. So we're not really thinking about, it's only successful if after the first exposure, you never feel anxious again. That's not the success. The success is that you showed up to the exposure. You also want to have clients measure their levels of distress. This is where SUDS comes in, right? That you want clients to measure how distressed they were before the exposure. And then after they go through the exposure, and that usually has a time limit, you want clients to be in the exposure for long enough for their anxiety to peak and come down. So when the exposure is completed, that's when you have clients look back and say, okay, well, how distressed did I become? Okay, and then what's my distress now? So you should have kind of 3 measures of distress: before, and then what's the highest, what's the peak, and then after. You also want to discuss, you want to choose the best type of exposure, discuss the likely outcomes, and you develop a hierarchy, right? And so we don't throw a client into the highest, most distressing thing that we can think of. We start with actually relatively easy, low distress activities to help a client build up kind of their own confidence and their own sense of having their own resources. So by the time we get to the higher, more distressing levels, a client feels like, okay, I can handle this. And then you practice. A client can't just expose themselves once. They have to expose themselves over and over and over again until they really get to the place where their SUDS levels are actually super low. Or hopefully that the experience is kind of boring to them. So it's like no distress at all. This is an example of an exposure tracking log. So you see there's the exposure exercise. What are the safety behaviors that a person might normally do to avoid, right? So I recently went to a professional networking event. I didn't know anyone, and I had an impulse to like grab my phone, right? That is a safety behavior, because if I'm looking at my phone, I'm distracted. I don't have to feel anxious about knowing anyone. I don't have to worry, are people going to talk to me? Are people wondering what she's doing here? So I had to resist my inclination to do that and keep my phone. But that's a safety behavior, for example. You want the reminders, anything that the client needs to keep in mind, to be on the exposure tracking form. As you can see, there's the SUDS scale here, so they can kind of remember what the levels are. And then you have, when did you do it? How long did you do it for? What were your SUDS ratings? And what did you notice? Right? And this is really helpful for them to do between sessions and then talk about when they come back. Progressive muscle relaxation is something that I wanted to introduce. We're not going to have time to do it, but I did want you to at least see it and hear about it. Often clients with anxiety have trouble sleeping, and progressive muscle relaxation is one technique that you can teach them to really help them release tension from their bodies and from their muscles to prepare their body for sleep. You can do progressive muscle relaxation in a short form or even a long form. And really, it is the practice of guided muscle tension and releasing. And so you begin with the breath and you teach clients to tighten their muscles for at least 10 seconds. And so it could look like having them squeeze their eyes shut, right? Or like having them keep their shoulders up by their earlobes and then drop the shoulders, completely relaxing, right? Completely relaxing their eyes. And so they relax for like 5 seconds and then they go back to the next muscle group. They move from the top of the body all the way to the feet as a way of relaxing the whole body, ultimately tensing and releasing. In the handout, there's also a YouTube video that provides a guided step-by-step example of how to use PMR. It's really popular for helping sleep and also quite effective. So we're right at 12:59. That ends our CBT for anxiety workshop today. If you have any questions or thoughts or any clarity about something, or you're like, Dr. Green, I don't understand that, or that didn't make sense to me, or why did you say that? Please feel free to drop something in the chat or email me or Stephanie, and we will certainly kind of get back with you. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. Hopefully you can use some of these tools in your work this week. Please take care of yourselves and be well in your work, and we will talk next week.